I'm sorry. I sort of lost my connection with my live broadcast. Okay, so I just again when I'm sorry that I might have to do some editing here, but part of the reason why I'm doing this podcast too is that a lot of times when I talk about healthy human sexuality and just the experience I've had in my life, people find it funny. So I say, well, as the fry bread burns or as the bannock burns, because human relationships, even though they may not seem, or people like, especially for me, when I was sexually active, I didn't see the ripple effect of who I was in contact with, and I again, we're all human. We have this, whether they say there's a third eye that we don't actually see who we truly are, and so and the things when I explain stuff like this, people find it funny, and again, like I said, it's like a soap opera, and I guess that's why soap operas appeal to so many people. But anyway, this elderly woman who was in the nursing home had mentioned that there were horny old men in the nursing home, and she, just wrinkled up her face in disgust, and she made an explanation. She says, well, I think they're that way when they're elderly because of World War II, and that there weren't that many women around. Now, this woman, when I was sitting there talking with her, she didn't know men had a G-spot or women had a G-spot. She did confide to me that she was so naive when she was younger that she never really explored topics on human sexuality. So that's one of the reasons why I thought I'd do my podcast. And I sort of briefly touch on some of the subject matter, in my previous podcasts. And it's not to mansplain or say anything, because I'm no expert. Far from it. But the reality of it is like, some people need to hear stuff that maybe they're too shy to talk about, or maybe it's too triggering. And that's where I'm talking about active addiction. Sometimes when we're actively involved in limerence and we're hearing stuff about sexuality, as what I'm going to be talking about in this podcast, they shut down. And that's the critical part of limerence, I believe, from my opinion. It's like alcohol or drugs or somebody who's involved in porn or active addiction in food. When there's an imbalance of the central nervous system, we unconsciously shut down and go, la, 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 la. This is my life. Like, I don't need to talk to you about this. La, 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 la. Okay, so there was, in the Beatles in the 62 or 63, when they first came to the Americas, they were on the Ed Sullivan Show, and they toured the United States. And that tour, they called it the Pissing Tour. And the reasoning for the Pissing Tour is that the teenagers and young women, like in their late teens, early 20s, would attend the concerts in these stadiums, and they would be so sexually excited because this was a revolutionary way of music. It was very open, like it was a sexual revolution, because nobody dared to sing these songs. Like today in 2026, I mean, I'm talking about like in the 60s. Even before that, in the 50s, music, like, it seems so primitive. Okay, again, so drenched in religiosity and oppression and taboos, like to keep control over people, especially patriarchy having control over matriarchy, or just the female psyche. But the girls, like, hello, yeah, they pissed themselves in the tour. Now, why is this so important? Well, as we evolve as women and learning about our physiology and even the clitoris, like I said, this lady that I met who's in a nursing home, she didn't know about male G-spot or where the female G-spot is. So even if I were to have discussions about the female clitoris and the anatomy, it would be very difficult for her to actually sit in comfort to talk about this, because her entire life has been suppressed. So that's why, like, when I'm saying a lot of times in our active addiction, we don't realize that when we feel uncomfortable, we don't do self-reflection and understand why it is that we feel so uncomfortable. Now, as women age and after having babies, and the thing is, like I've never had children. So for me, this whole aging process with incontinence is something new. But for a lot of women who've had numerous children, this is something that they live with most of their lives. Now, as a female ages in terms of premenopause and menopause, and I'm not an expert, I just know that there's a high rate of, what do they call it, urinary tract infections. And the reality of when there's no estrogen, that you have to have estrogen therapy. And the reasoning for that is because a lot of older women, when they have so many UTIs, that they can get infected and die from sepsis. So it's a choice that older women who have incontinence need to really look at in terms of longevity. At the same time, too, the debate in women and having orgasm in terms of fluids that discharge, there's been the debate whether it's been, like what types of fluids are discharged. And again, it's easier to talk about men because we say that it's like they ejaculate. But for a lot of women, it's just like you just don't talk about it because, again, a lot of the identity of women and what women's bodies go through when they choose to have children is so enormous in terms of hormone fluctuation, in terms of just bonding with the newborn baby. They bond for 5 years. That's why I say my psychology and my hypersexuality is based on that 5-year bond with my mother and my environment. So understand this. When a woman is having babies, and if she's an active addiction in terms of like not just infatuation but limerence because it's a way of surviving, that's how her coping is. And as she evolves and looking and nurturing her child, she loses herself. She loses her identity because her identity is put into that child. Now, you have to understand the whole physiology of females, too. I was in my grandmother's body. When my grandmother was pregnant with my mother, I was there as a little amoeba cell. I existed in my grandmother. So all this for women and for all babies born, it's essential to understand the whole nature of the biology and just the whole nature of nurturing. So what does that have to do? Well, when a woman's in crisis and she doesn't have a stable, friendly, loving, supportive environment, a lot of times the hormones and the things that happen in the chemistry of creating life plays a big part in the child's development. Environmental. So the highest rate of pseudohermaphrodites are born in the Middle East, around Israel, Palestine, like there, because of the crisis. Like any woman who's involved in that type of war and just the whole structure, the body adapts for women. And so these children are born, and they're born female because the first 2 weeks of pregnancy, everyone's female. And so the female biology and what's happening to the female, what she eats for the first before she's even pregnant, the first 5 years before she's pregnant is what the child is being made out of. So if you're in active drug and alcohol addiction, that plays a big key role in the child being developed, as well as too if you're starving and you're in poverty. That's why this whole psychology of limerence isn't just the actual physiology of it. It's also like the environmental. So when I was working in the state hospital, they had one section for just children. And some of the children that were there were pseudohermaphrodites who were born female. And in the process of going into puberty, they were developing penises. So, and sometimes children are born with two sexes, and so you have to determine. Now, what does it have to do with Indigenous people? Well, in the 70s, and I've always been interested in this, in the sense that like in terms of my own sexuality and the choices I've made to not be married or have children, was always interesting to see, like in British North Guiana, and again, it's a different, they changed the name. There was a tribe, and there were, I think there were 18 pseudohermaphrodites that were born. And again, this is just, there was no doctors, psychologists, social workers. This was just babies that were born, and they grew penises, and so they did a study. And so it's like environmental or nurturing, all that. And they found out of the 18, I think 15 of the girls who morphed into men chose to remain as males. I think one chose to remain as female, and the other one, is I think asexual. So the biology overrode, or we'll say, the 5 years of that development of that child when they're out of the woman, they're born, and all this nurturing and the biology of just having somebody like take care of you is essential in like nobody interfering. Like they in science fiction they call the prime directive: don't interfere with, other organisms. But essentially that's it's not a question of choice. It's just a question of biology. And so, when people talk about limerence and all this adaptation, when you have so many white therapists and psychologists who, claim to be this white savior, or like, well, I know my psychology, I know all this stuff, and they come into our communities, preaching this science that they learned in academia. And yet, in my previous podcast, I was talking about Indigenous and Black psychologists trying to publish in the journal in the Canadian Psychology Association, which was rejected, which is all a part of this truth and reconciliation and the actions to reconciliation that they totally bastardized, where they had to take the journal into the United States and have it published. So all this dichotomy in the sense of like, who knows what and why? This whole erasure thing of like, Indigenous people, like where the hell was the whole world 10, 20,000 years ago? Or even 500 years ago? Like Indigenous people have been living their lives and without any interference. So when I say I'm 74 and they started building a fence around Sutina, that, like, understand this. In the late 1800s, like when they discovered oil in Alberta, and just the whole nature of setting up the Indian Act to control our trust funds. So, that we have to use this law just to access our trust funds, or even change the law to protect our own children and our women. The whole process of doing that in 2026 is happening. Imagine. Like, when people say, oh, Indigenous people, you're lazy or blah, blah. Hey, you're not under the same laws as we are. And the very fact of the struggle to get these laws passed by patriarchs, by people, non-Indigenous people, who really think that they have the best interest of Indigenous peoples, how to handle their lands, their sovereignty. This is ridiculous, especially under the Indian Act and the law, when you have so many Indigenous people who've scrutinized it since the 70s or 60s. Because why? We were allowed to go to school and go to university. We were allowed to have degrees without losing our status. We were allowed to be part of the bigger system. But yet at the same time, it came at a price. And it's still coming at a price. like I said, sovereignty over the jurisdiction of our children, having those rights in our Indigenous, First Nations, Métis communities, as well as like who is called Indigenous and who belongs to our communities. Those rights, those sovereign rights, are just now being implemented in 2026. So yes, if people want to take over and say, oh, you don't know how, you like check yourself. No, you need to check yourself and what you know about history and what you know about the dynamics of actually what's happening within what we call the human family in terms of evolution. So again, why is it so important? Well, there's a time and a place that's coming. And I think a lot of women that aren't Indigenous who are actually aging now, who've spent their whole life being individuals, their whole life serving their male patriarch, finally come to the point that they don't need to, like when you're going through menopause, you don't have that same hormones that geared you to be complacent and comply to your male partner. Again, like because you didn't have a choice. So understand this: when women have choices to choose their sexual partner, that's in our DNA. Like I said, the first 2 weeks of life, all mammals are female. So doesn't it follow suit that our basic psychology too would determine who we're hypersexually attracted to? All men and all women are hypersexual. The reality of it is, though, you get colonized white men who are sexually aroused in the notion that there's some sort of fantasy or fallacy about Indigenous women, and that they need to conquer us or hunt us. Because why? We're matriarch. I'm talking about Western Canada. We as Indigenous women don't have the same social structure as Eastern Canada. Okay, so a lot of the things, and culturally, in terms of just learning our songs and dance and teaching our children, is something that we have embraced. And because of social media now that we can do this, we can say, look at who we are. We can choose who our partner is going to be. And the reality of it is, like, most people who the past 500 years under patriarchy have been chosen by men. The biology of it is changing, and I think the majority of women, as they grow older and live in nursing homes or find themselves targeted by these horny men who stalk them in these nursing homes, like, knocking on the door, creeping into their rooms, like they just don't have any safety net. Like that woman just looked at disgust, like I have to live in this environment like until the rest of her life. When when you're thinking, where is the safety, especially when there's such a fragmentation of what rape culture is. Even the sense of like a system that has been indoctrinated into this reality of what is safe and what isn't. There's a lady her name is Meena Rae, R-A-E. And she talks about the Spanish when they came over and the whole conquest of like the rape culture of Indigenous women. And also how it evolved into men, especially Hispanic men, and their attitude towards their own mothers, their own sisters and stuff like that. It's amazing too. Now, why am I talking about men at the same time? Well, you look at this president and you have all these people, understand this. When I was taking psychology in the United States, I had a instructor, and then understand this, my instructors were PhD holders. They weren't masters. They had PhDs. And this lady worked for the Pentagon, and she had worked in Europe, looking at letters that were related from Russia to the president. And she would have to do a dossier on like what was the motives for this letter, etc. High-level security clearance, and she got sick, so she had to move back to the States because of medical reasons. And she took this university training. She took this job as a professor. And she was saying to me, or saying to the class that when it comes to just the reality of how people can look and analyze people, like forensics. Like I said, I had an acquaintance for 30 years who was a forensic psychologist. So the practice and the dialogue that I've had with him, I'm not saying I'm an expert. No, I'm not. I'm just saying that we have intuition. And the more we develop, and like I said, every 10 years, the more we do self-reflection and understand and get certain skills, especially if you're meeting people and having some discourse with them, you start to learn about yourself and others. So this whole dichotomy of this president and all the educated people who've dissected and analyzed this man who, and the reality of what made him who he is. It's really interesting because it all follows on who his father was and how his father treated him. And at the same time, too, he had a brother who was so totally like bastardized by their father. So he died in his 40s, where here is this man who's president now, who, just basically did everything and was the shadow of his father. No, like I'll say, no backbone. As my late father would say, to have a backbone is important. No matter, I mean, my father died at a young age too. Okay, so when I talk about the relationship with men and their fathers, it has a huge impact. And so why am I saying this? Is because when you're looking at people, especially men who are cult leaders, who have this following of people who emulate this person who's lying his way and saying this is the way things are, and I'm the only person who is telling the truth. And you have all these people invested in that individual. Now that's colonial. That's a way of thinking, very patriarchal. So again, why is this so important? Well, because, like I mentioned before, there are so many cults, because understand, ritual abuse has been around since the beginning of time. And the majority of times when people critique ritual abuse within their religion, their society, and they see the underbelly of life. A lot of times we look at Jeffrey Epstein and the underbelly of the United States. We can look at the underbelly of Sutina and our chief, Roy Whitney. We can look at the underbelly of Nathan Chasinghorse and his 350 followers. Now, a lot of times when I've talked about intergenerational trauma, in the sense of, like, I'm trying to let people understand, there are actual people who've been traumatized. And then there are people who talk and have a narrative to have some sort of discourse about the common sense around what trauma does and triggers within people. That is psychologically part of just evolution. Okay, so there's no ifs, ands, or buts about it. When I say that my grandmother was in residential school and that my parents were there, and as I'm growing up and I've seen them get involved in cults, like look at the Calgary Stampede. My grandparents were, in the Indian village for decades and then kicked out. My parents were involved with moral rearmament, a cult established during the Second World War, and also the foundation of AA. Again, active addiction. And these are all psychologists, okay? We're talking about this whole patriarchy and the foundation of the things that are considered psychological standards that are practiced by active therapists and social workers. So I also say too, like, okay, when you're involved in a cult, sometimes when you put so much investment in it and you know it's not right, you sort of melt into the background or melt into the bush and disappear. However, there are people who have given so much to that cult that they've invested so much that when the cult collapses, they themselves, it's so hard to endure. Like, some try to kill themselves because they can't believe that they wasted their whole life dedicated to this leader, this cult leader. And that's just part of, again, ritual abuse in the psyche of human evolution and who we are as human beings. So what happens? Like, so when I say, yes, I had to do some self-reflection, I'm going, so what was, each time there's a hint of a cult, and for anybody, it's like you get this feeling like, I should have known better, or why did I get that word that was told to me, grifters. Why did I get grifted into following this cult, and how hurt you are when you get grifted. And so, like, for me, like I said, the evolution, like even I didn't understand the reasoning, the religiosity of my parents with the Anglican Church. I didn't understand their commitment to moral rearmament. But my mother, and the conversations I've had with her, I'm really grateful that the love she had for my dad, so that I could understand, like, just how heartbreaking it was. That when they really needed people from within the cult, that they abandoned them. And that's what I mean, like, there's the self-destruction that you put so much into a cult and they abandon you. Or you realize, like, they're not who they think they are. And that's rightfully so too. Like, when I became Mormon, I wasn't, like, totally into the cult. I didn't go on a Mormon mission. I didn't go to the Mormon temple. Sure as hell didn't date any Mormon men. And again, too, a lot of that had to do with just the stereotype or the stigma that a lot of the foster kids who had identity issues and shame and guilt about coming from poverty, looking at me as if I reminded them of where they came from. Which, to me, I'm grateful that they had that biased attitude towards me, because it was easy for me just not to participate anymore. And the more I took care of my mother, the more I realized, like, she needed socialization. And she used to say to me, why are you inviting the Mormons? I said, because, Mom, you need company. You need people to talk to. And we had a discussion, like, when she would die and what she wanted. And I said to her, there's a lot of things that I can't do because you'll be gone. You won't be there to defend me or support me. And sure enough, within my family, my mom's been gone almost 15 years, 2013. And there are certain fractions of my family who refuse to talk to me, shunning me. And I tell people, my family, yes, when we were growing up, when we were younger, like 50, 40 years ago, there was active addiction in terms of alcohol and drugs. But after that, nothing. So what is it? What is it unique? Well, it has to do with intergenerational trauma. And so you take away the equation, you take away the alcohol and drugs, you still have intergenerational trauma, the psychology of limerence, the psychology of the cult, and holding on to things that you're suppressing because without even knowing it, you're still actively involved in the addiction. Because why else would you not want to talk openly about healthy human sexuality, or even what a cult is, or the whole dynamics of who you support in leadership roles? So, again, very hard transition each time in terms of my evolution, in terms of my identity. So when Nathan Choisinghorse came, and the majority of my family is Mormon, and again, too, like at that time, I was taking care of my late mother, just to support her because she speaks Dakota. And a lot of what he was preaching had to do with, like sweats and sundance. And so when I accompanied her to the ceremonies, or even her talking to Nathan, it was really something to watch. So if I don't know if she was the key in my just distrusting him, or just the reality, like I knew who my mother was and who my father was. And the whole reality of like, my goodness, my whole identity is crashing down. Like, who am I in terms of being Indigenous and being a woman? Not even understanding like all the history that was followed in terms of intergenerational trauma in how my parents, will say, groomed me. And so I had to deal with all that religiosity. And yes, I went to therapy. Like I said, I had, and even like, I got you. You have to understand, when I moved back from Utah, I had to go, and I had to deal with a lot of trauma that I experienced as a young woman here, being sexually assaulted. So all that was based on healing and my understanding of a healthy human sexuality. So you have to understand too, my going to a therapist, even during like 20 years ago, that was nothing new. It was part of my way of looking at keeping myself healthy in terms of mental health. So, like again, I said I had a acquaintance a forensic psychologist for 30 years. So it wasn't like that. I didn't have somebody to talk to, or even a therapist to talk to about what was happening in my life. So, say for example, there's a lot of young people in social media who have been part of the 60s scoop, or have just recently got their status cards, who are trying to reconnect to communities. And there's a lot of young people in my community who've been in foster care, who come back to my community, who are reconnecting with elders. And, well, they're elders now, but for me, when I was younger, I didn't know all these things were happening to all these children. And again, too, because I chose not to have children, and I chose not to be in relationships. So a lot of the connection to my community, it wasn't there. Only if I chose to interact and go out socializing with other people in my community. So what I'm trying to say is that, just like all the followers of Nathan Chasing Horse, the ones that I met in Las Vegas, who had followed him for decades, they said they didn't know they were drinking the Kool-Aid. And the reality of like how much they invested. And for Lynette, with her daughter, Sierra, it was the fact that she almost lost her daughter. And it shook her to the very core. So that it's not the same analogy, but I want to say, like, when you discover that you're in a cult and you have to leave it, it's life-changing. So when I say, yes, I've grown up in this environment, and that every 10 years or so I've evolved, but that evolution had to do with changing how I thought about what I was associated with in terms of a cult. And that's why it's so difficult for people to understand if they're still actively involved in active addiction, because that active addiction is associated with whatever support or false sense of who you're supporting. So it's really difficult for anybody who wants to have some sort of support group in terms of active addiction, either alcohol, drugs, limerence, you name it. There's always going to be people who don't want to hear it. They don't want to hear it. They don't want to deal with it. They just like are going around their own business, actively involved in their own addiction. So I'll say an example. Most of my relatives, and this is like as the Bannock Burns kind of soap opera here, and at this point I want to say hello to Darcy and Marie. I I know I should have said it at the beginning of my podcast, but it's nice to know that there are people out there who are actively listening to my podcast, and I get some feedback from them. So so what was I talking about now? Again, most of what I tried to talk about in terms of active addiction, when I talk about Indigenous women having battle fatigue, it's because when you're in active addiction, and I'll use an analogy, and this is just, you can say, oh well, it's Marina. This is her behavior. So say if Marina Crane is into gambling, pornography, and fast food. What does that mean? Okay, that would mean that Marina would have to be, say, gambling every day, maybe every week, or pornography, that I'd have to be watching pornography every night, every week, or is it once a week, once every 2 weeks, or once a month? The same with fast foods, is Marina involved in eating fast foods every day? So I'm using that, okay, three active things that the central nervous system is associated with. Now, when you're dealing with active addiction, you need to be loving to yourself. So if you're constantly in say, any of these, what did I say? Gambling, pornography, fast food, you need to wean yourself off slowly. So from every day to maybe once a week, or twice, maybe twice or 3 times a day, or not a day, a week. So as you're weaning yourself off from these 3 addictions, active addictions, eventually you'll get to a point, well, say maybe you're just doing it once a month. Okay, so your central nervous system is starting to get some balance, and sometimes too, maybe you're not even actively participating in gambling, pornography, and junk food. Now, the majority of my life, I haven't been involved in any of those 3. It wasn't until during the pandemic that I started experimenting, living within it. I started gambling, 20 years ago. But again, I wasn't actively every day, it's for me, I've had to understand my own central nervous system. And the same thing, like I said, even with pornography, I didn't even know it existed until the pandemic. And again, too, even as I'm aging, I didn't understand as we age and become seniors that the whole nature of being hypersexual never dies. Until my late parents used to say, it ain't over till you're 6 feet under. So they actively, were preparing me for growing up to become a human being. So why I'm saying this is the majority of women that I do know that are around my age who are still working, who have multiple jobs. Sometimes they're making anywhere from $5,000 to $10,000 a month. Now, you might say, oh, wow, that's a hell of a lot of money. And yes, it is. But understand this. The battle fatigue that these women, these elder Indigenous women, have to endure every day because they're the single breadwinner. Even as senior citizens, they are single breadwinners to their adult children and to their grandchildren. The whole dichotomy of the Indian Act and the very threat of systemic racism in terms of children being apprehended or people being put in jail, and you enable your children to be codependent on you, the only way you can deal with the central nervous system is to actively take part in gambling, pornography, and fast food addictions. So the reality of it is when people are triggered that way, and I try to talk to them, they project it onto me, and it's sad because they don't want to see that I'm not in like I. It would be different if my entire life was part of an active addiction, and that's why I think my podcast is important, to let people know that as an Indigenous woman, no, there are a lot of people who don't have the capacity to cope with things, but sometimes of that is very systemic. Sometimes women who've married white men, and white men who, like, there's violence and the white man takes the child away, and what happens to the Indigenous woman? So by the time they become my age, they can't look after themselves. Is it any fault of their spouse or their children or their community? So a lot of times those ladies who never married white men but do have children from Indigenous men haven't ever had support from their Indigenous husbands or partners. And so they're raising their children as single women. I mean, my mother did. My father, when he wasn't active in his addiction, he was a good provider. He was a good man. Now, the research, or not the research, I'm just talking from my own lived experience and what I try to say to Indigenous older women. If they don't want it, if they're triggered, they won't listen to me. I kid you not. I had a very good friend. I was friends with her for 30 years. When the beginning of our friendship, I was so naive. Like I said, I've evolved in my identity. When I knew her, like, there's a difference too with people that I know. Throughout my friendship with her, she never once said anything bad about her children, never talked about what her children said to her or if they were fighting with her, nothing. You know, I could pick up the phone and say, let's go out. And in a drop of a hat, she'd be here in an hour and we'd go out for lunch or something, movie, whatever. And throughout my friendship with her, I knew she had sexual partners. She never physically married them because she was still legally married to her 5 children's father. I think that she got a divorce, but I used to ask her, why didn't she file for child support? And she says, well, because she's married into the community. And she says, if I file for child support, when my children become adults, they won't have access to the patriarchy, the colonial construct in Sutina, where if her children wanted to have a house built, they'd have to have it built on their father's section. That was her rationale for not applying for child support the entire time her children were growing up. Now that, like, again, she was an amazing woman, but yet she just couldn't regulate her central nervous system. The partners that she had were alcoholics. I don't know where she found them, but she'd drive them around, go get alcohol, they drink, and the relationships would maybe last a year or a couple of months. But it was the relationship she had with those men reflects on her relationship to her children. So now that she's been she's left, and I tell people, the majority of women that I've been friends with who've died, I've helped organize their funerals. I've helped dress them, wash their bodies. You know, just like when I talk about, like the reality of, what it takes to change the way we think when we lose someone we love. And that's just not family, like that's just us as human beings. So when I talk to my friends who are collecting pension now, or they're at 60, and they're supporting their adult children and grandchildren, some of them talk about their children or their grandchildren, and some it's really awful, and some it's not. But the same premise is that they're helping because they're the breadwinner. They've been consistent in doing such fabulous work for their First Nations, Inuit, or Métis communities. Now, the reality of it is like now that they're seniors and they're still sexual human beings, because of how they're enmeshed with their adult children, because they chose to have children in their senior years, anything that has to do with finding a partner, because it ain't over till we're 6 feet under, is related to the relationship they have with their children. So in that sense too, a lot of senior women, we will not engage in sexual activity because they're so enmeshed in the lives of the children that they gave birth to, and that tie to that identity that they gave that child for the first 5 years of their lives is critical, because the woman lost herself, and if she doesn't have the support to regain the identity she had before she was pregnant, it can become linear in the sense of relapse and recovery being almost non-existent. So when I talk about relapse and recovery and limerence or any addiction, it has to do at periods in your life where there was some balance of your central nervous system. But if your central nervous system has always been ignited, fired up like a firework, and that's all you know in the terms of that chemical in the brain, that dopamine, that whatever is those pistons that are firing off in your synapses, then it's going to be really difficult to basically step back and go cold turkey. And that's why I think a lot of women who make a lot of money, and are thinking that they can live a life where, because they have this money, they become prisoners within their own social structure, and they don't find a way. Like, again, it's battle fatigue, and it's not just with Indigenous women. I think it's women who are minorities. At the same time, too, there was one article that I was looking at in TikTok where they were talking about, like, an Indigenous woman was talking about white women and how it's really difficult for Indigenous women to have white female friends. I didn't quite get right into it, but I understand that. I do, because when I talk to my friends and my relatives, the bottom line is, throughout my life, and again, maybe this is a reflection of my own stupidity or naivete, or the reality of what privilege, the perceived cultish privilege of white women. The reality of it is like, why would I chase them to be friends? It's like a cult. Like, as women, what is it? I being grifted by white women, and I'm going, why are white women doing that? Why are they chasing after information that I have? Or why are white therapists or psychologists doing this? Especially when they want to come into Indigenous, Métis, or First Nations communities. Like, it's amazing, because it's almost like an adoption or adapting, not in a sense, but it's a false way of understanding your own history, your own identity, because it's like a false sense of purpose, and again, like I said, when a person gets into a nursing home, and you just feel like you don't have the autonomy, you're stuck in a room, and you have a common TV room, and you have a common dining room. I know when they had the pandemic, there was an increase of sexually transmitted diseases amongst the seniors, and one family member their father was in the dining room, and he stood up and he yelled in the nursing home. He yells in the dining room. He says, "I need sex." So the administrators called his sons in, and the solution was to get a laptop, an iPad, and turn him on to pornography through the internet, which settled him down. Okay, so other times too, adult children put their parents into a nursing home, and they find out that their mother has become promiscuous, and it's heartbreaking for the children to go, "That's our mother." So a lot of these things, when I talk about regulating your central nervous system and understanding your human sexuality and the origins of it, and your, like, the reality that you're a hypersexual human being from the time we're born until the time it's time to leave, and how we adjust or how we adapt or how we even interpret people that we meet in our lives is important and vital to our very existence. Like I said, throughout my life, I've met various people who've helped me, in some sense, understand this whole nature of nurture and nature. And at the same time, too, I might have it wrong, but the majority of times, when I listen to what others say in social media, it's critical for me to have some sort of what do they call it? Critical thinking skills, especially when we have a lot of young Indigenous social media influencers who have some extreme issues with their own cult, how they dealt with stuff, especially when it has to do with religion and this born-again Christian movement, or this ideology of like having white cohorts or allies, and then realizing that they've been grifting you. Especially when it puts such stress on the young person to understand like what's happening, especially when they don't have community or holistic or like holistic and collective ways of thinking. Understanding that too is part of like, understanding like, yes, we do live in cults. We do live in limerence. We do live in this trauma. We do live in this environment of evolution. But it's important to understand that everything changes. We do not have control over our lives. Creator, grandfathers and grandmothers, their will is being done in our very existence, our very psychology, our very self-talk. The self-talk that we have within ourselves projects onto other people that we integrate with on a daily basis. So as much as I regret and look at people that I've met and befriend throughout my life, and especially in the past, we'll say 5 years, 3 years, 2 years, and they've slipped away very like nonchalantly, and just like, okay, they're gone. I mean, some of them, it's like that. Others, it's like, okay, validation, I've got closure, you've got closure. Hallelujah. See you later, alligator, in a wild crocodile type of attitude. And that's fine, because, it's validation that I have my life, they have their life. But there's other times when the offense looks like an offense. And that's where I think white fragility comes in, because the reality of putting boundaries down would make it easier, but it's amazing. For me, I think maybe because, say for white men, it's because they're in a position of power their whole life. They don't know what it's like to lose your identity. That it's easier for them to say, oh, I can take care of my own life. Whereas women, it's more of like, well, I can help you. See, the reality of it is, in our psychology or in our biology, yes, we do have choices as women, but I think it's throughout our lives. If we have validation, the reality, if the reality is valid, then yes, we can say, I understand. But there's a hell of a lot of women who don't. And it makes it a fallacy or unrealistic. So, and it's really hard to critique such women because they keep on banging their head against the wall, even though, like, for example, I've continually have said to an acquaintance, I do not like non-Indigenous people, white people, becoming therapists and coming into First Nations Indigenous communities. It's as if Indigenous people don't have the wherewithal to understand how we heal. And the fact is that that's been always my stance with this individual. And yet, all of a sudden, just ghosted me. And again, no, like, I kept on saying to this individual, I've met white women. This is, and for me, it's the grifting that I think, as old as I am, I'm going, not again, but it is so. It is so. And I'm just grateful that throughout my life and throughout the decades, that when I've had issues with even my siblings or my cousins or my neighbors or people I've grown up with in Sutina, that we may not talk for a year or so, but we talk, we hug, we embrace. I just, I wish people, as hard as people want to say how difficult it is to live in First Nations, Inuit, and Métis communities, there is a sense of belonging. And there are people who do self-regulate, who do have balance, who do share, their struggles. And it's that sharing of that struggle that gives you strength to keep going. And even though it's hard for me to grieve over white friends who just within this month I've had to, say since the past 4 months, 6 months, I've had to, just release them. Like throughout my acquaintance or friendship with them, I've embraced them. Now it's releasing them. And it's the hardest thing for me as an Indigenous elder woman to do. But it's the hardcore reality. I know I jokingly say that I have white uncles, and I have, first cousins who have never visited me, either through shame or guilt. But even when I do meet them and I do visit them, there's always this strangeness of how they think I live or what my capacity is. It's almost as if I'm going to get something or I want something from them. And yet all I wanted to do is say hello. So, whatever the contribution I have to give to my audience in terms of this podcast, I just wanted to, and I keep on saying this, and I will continue saying this, the struggles with being infatuated with someone that's unobtainable, and then to be obsessed with them for however long, maybe a week, a month, a year, 2 years, 3 years, however long it takes, the relapse and recovery of that obsession is based on how well your central nervous system is attached to active addiction. And the more you are guided through eliminating a self-defeating behavior, the easier it is to recover after you relapse. It's just a human condition where there's no therapy, no social work, none of this structure of thou shalt not that is embedded in our very DNA. So be kind to yourselves, love yourselves, because there's so many people out there who are gifted, who are healers, who are these invisible helping hands. And for whatever purpose we find or whatever mission in our lives we feel that we're compelled to do these things, it's important. And so for me, part of the reality of escaping some form of cult is to embrace, like for me, my Indigenous spiritual side, and for me to honor the people who came before me. Not only that, but also to honor those people who've taught me lessons about myself, who are no longer going to be a part of my life. See, and that's the key thing, is that even though they walk away, even though like unceremoniously walk away, I have learned that there are good people out there who will walk away because they said this is closure for them, like validating their own journey. Isn't that what it means to be a good human being? See, when I define the word wachashta, it means a good man. There are good people out there who are also struggling to understand their own life's journey. And however we learn from these people, it's the reality that somewhere along the line we're going to be helping somebody else. I don't know how long I have in this life. Sometimes when I have my female relatives who are like at battle fatigue, they project onto me, well, you're not healthy. You're not this, you're not that. And I'm listening to them and I'm going, I am healthy. I am living my life. I don't know how else to explain it. The reality of growing older and trying to keep ourselves busy and understand human nature, and just the reality that, we forget things. We develop dementia, Alzheimer's, and whatever other things that we still hold on to in terms of our limerence, our mental health, our obsessions. Even if that's why when you say, bipolar, schizophrenia, those mental health conditions, there's so many other things that are attached to the human journey that we have to be naive and vulnerable enough to talk to people, to trust people. And hopefully, because we have a certain way of thinking and saying, I'm not going to participate in this, especially when you choose to not be sexually active, and for people to not understand that this is my coping mechanism, this is my way of protecting myself. And the reality of it is, like, when I choose to be attached or associated to someone that I'm attracted to, it's important to validate that. It's taken me so many lifetimes, and maybe in a previous lifetime before I was even born here, I needed to come here into this realm to see it and to learn about it. But isn't that what life is all about? So as a woman, and men who are all hypersexual, for the men, take it easy on us women. You've had 5,000 years of dominance and, reality of, like, you can walk around being cocky and chauvinistic and, prancing around like you're God's gift to women, when the reality of it is like, no, it's a woman who chooses because she's hypersexual. And she's only hypersexual to a certain type of man in her psyche. Like I said, that psyche is attached to how we perceive things in the first 5 years of our lives. That's my discovery of who I am and why I do and behave the way I do. It's a little different than most women because I said, all I had were men. All I had were uncles. And how they nurtured and validated me, I'm grateful. I'm grateful for these men in my life. Throughout my life, I've had various Indigenous women and women castrate me over my attitude towards men when they themselves haven't had the same type of structure that I've had around men. And of course, people, when they see me, they'll see me as a senior, a grandma. But even then, when I was a young woman and was sexually active, whatever and however people perceived me, it was my choice. It's always been my choice. And it took a lot of healing to realize, like, some of the things that I chose because I don't have this fear response, put me in a position where I was sexually assaulted. And a lot of the things that I've been involved in terms of gravitating to people who don't have the, they're not good people. That how dare I even thought they were good. But again, that's the human condition. And it's important to say that we're not perfect. We make mistakes, and we'll continue to make mistakes. But the reality of it is, I miss those people that I've had to release. But the reality of it too is that having closure, validating the closure, validating the fact that there was sexual attraction because I'm hypersexual, and the fact that to validate that it's my choice. The choice doesn't mean to be physically, sexually active. It just means the response in terms of talking and trusting is open. Again, I hope this has some insight into active addiction, because there is hope. I do really think, like, if it's so embedded in terms of emotional pain, then go and seek help. And if you've gone to spiritual people and it's not enough, go and seek professional help. But shop around. Don't just go to any therapist who just enjoys writing everything that you're talking about, because they have no boundaries. Don't go to someone who just wants to, like, again, grift you. There are therapists who grift you. So shop around. Again, if you do find that you're getting some qualified and some really good critiques and helping you, then you're on your path and your way to healing. I'm just grateful, again, that I met so many different educated people throughout my life, and have taught me different things that I didn't even know I was going to go down this path. Didn't even have the slightest understanding of ritual abuse, of intergenerational trauma, of cults, and how it's the very foundation of humanity. And that as long as we are kind to ourselves, when we break away from that thinking, that leader or that cult leader, that we're gentle with ourselves. And it just breaks it right down to family violence. You breaking away from someone who you've allowed to control you. So I hope this helps. And again, I'm grateful for everybody who listens to my podcast. I appreciate it. Have a good day. It's a little, like I said, it's a little cloudy out, but today I'm going to be going to a Mexican restaurant. And yesterday I went to have ramen soup. And tomorrow I'll go shopping, and I'm just grateful and thankful that I have social media in terms of a podcast. 20 years ago, it was just writing on my blog. So if I have anything else to put on my blog, I will do that. But I appreciate all the people who are interested in my life and the things that I'm doing every day, just trying to understand what it is that's happening in this province, in Alberta, and in the world. Like I said, at any time, we don't even know what the capacity of having peace in this world, when there's so much, like the fires all over the world, the droughts, the starvation. This has been evolution. This has always been the case, even when I was a child. My parents, when they went to South America and saw all the poverty, India, the poverty. No matter how much people think things have changed, understand too, when I was a child, I think it was 3 billion or 4 billion people. Now it's doubled. It's not going to be easy for children. Something has to happen for our children, our grandchildren, our 7 generations. We have to, be conscious. I understand how to live off the land. I can't do that right now because I'm handicapped. But the majority of my life, I've had that life skill. Anyway, I regress, and sometimes when I do hear myself talk, I think about Wachashta and how he was curious about my life, which also has led me to be a part of so many other people's lives who listen to my stories and who validate the life journey that I've lived. It's important because there are so many thousands and thousands of people who have a gift to give you. And whether or not there's a conspiracy or an alter ego in what they're doing, give them that space. Let them into your life. Look at them and see them for who they are, because you need to be seen as well. Our whole lives, and sometimes our young children, struggle so hard to be seen. And when they find someone who sees them, sometimes they're dangerous people. So be kind to yourself and understand, this is human nature. We can heal, we can recover, and we also can relapse. And the more sophisticated and the more we practice it, the more we can see the red flags before they even come. A lot of times when I've had relatives project their insecurities on me, I believed them. So today I just let them be, and whenever the time is for them to call me, they'll do it. But I'm not going to chase them. And if they're needing time to heal and adjust to whatever stress they're going through, then it's their time. Okay, again, c'est la vie aujourd'hui. What else? Wopida Midakia Biyawasana. Creator, grandfathers, grandmothers, I will be done.